Of course, I'll first like to introduce you to our audience. Alex Vitale is professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and the City University of New York Graduate Center, and a visiting professor at London South Bank University. He has spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consults both police departments and human rights organizations internationally. Professor Vitale is the author of City of Disorder: How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics and the End of Policing, of course. His academic writings on policing have appeared in Policing and Society, Police Practice and Research, Mobilization, and Contemporary Sociology. He is also a frequent essayist, to say the least, whose writings have been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, The Nation, Vice News, Fortune, and USA Today. He has also appeared on CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, NPR, PBS, Democracy Now!, and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. And after Noah, he humbly accepted to talk about policing in my video podcast series, for which I'm highly thankful. Professor Vitale, welcome.
Thank you. Teşekkür ederim.
Oh, that was a thank you in Turkish, and he pretty much nailed it. So just a quick disclaimer: the questions I will present to Professor Vitale have nothing to do with questioning or undermining the individual police officers or personnel. We will be discussing more about the nature of policing as a mechanism overall. This is also a mini lecture for me under the guise of an interview, so I will occasionally be taking notes since I've managed to find Professor Vitale here. And of course, I like to start with your book, The End of Policing, which made an appearance in the Senate, and I was really fascinated by actually the what happened later on Twitter. Senator Ted Cruz showed your book during Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's hearing and defined the book in a warning tone as an advocacy for abolishing police. You have defiantly thanked Mr. Cruz for the sales later on and tweeted some of the arguments in the book as well. How would you comment on the book's appearance in the Senate and Senator Cruz's description of your book, which appears to be untouched? Also, what was the feedback from the people who read it afterwards?
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing that up. Totally an unexpected media appearance on the Senate in the Senate chambers. Well, in a way, it's nice to be associated with critical race theory, which I think has been an important doctrine within legal scholarship and within law school education. And I think my book is in a way influenced by critical race theory, which I have taught in my law and society courses, but I don't consider it to be a critical race theory text. And in a way, this just makes clear what is really going on here, which is that Ted Cruz is not at all interested in having discussions about legal scholarship. He's trying to shut down any critical conversations about the role of race in American society. And he does this in a neat little twist where he says, look, our choices are to treat race as a biological fact or to pretend that race doesn't exist as a salient social fact. And so for conservatives, anyone who brings up the issue of race is labeled a race essentialist and is accused of propping up the belief in biological racism. And what I tried to point out in an op ed that I wrote for The Nation right after this is that racism and race exist as social facts that have profound impacts on the lives of people who are labeled as racial others, as non white, and that we must have very frank and full discussions about both the history and ongoing practices of racism at the center of American society. So I was, very gratified by the boost in sales and some increased attention. It generated a number of additional media opportunities, which is great. But what is more important, I think, is that we continue to have these conversations about the role of racism in American society.
Right. Thank you. That's sort of clarifying, and I was following your tweets all along after watching the video for a few times how Senator Cruz talked about it, and I read the book, and I of course realized a huge gap between what you were arguing in depth and what he sort of very um, short-handedly sort of described it as. And from here, I like to maybe move on towards one of your main arguments in the book, which is the socio-economic function of police. And we know that Robert Peel's London Metropolitan Police model was adopted in the in the early 19th century, and it was adopted for the NYPD and maybe Boston as well, I think. And you claim in the book that the original modern policing body was tasked directly or indirectly with ensuring the class stratification and to perpetuate class conflict in a cliche vocabulary. Is policing a political instrument? Does it have any different use than just crime prevention? And I brought that book up called War, Power, and Police Power by Mark Neocleous, which has a very, I guess, similar line of argument with you as well.
Yes, and I reference Mark's work in my book, more his book, which is the new edition, the reprint is now called Police Power, the Fabrication of Social Order from Verso Press, which I think speaks more directly to this particular issue, which is, it's not an accident that the root of the word police is polis, which is, the referencing the basically the existence of government, of the state, and of the regulation of society. So we certainly can't think of policing independently of these overall governing strategies. And that really has been at the core of my analysis, is taking policing and placing it into this larger government context of both the state and, in a Foucauldian sense, governmentality more broadly, this regulation of society. And so when we look at the actual concrete origins of modern policing institutions through the late 18th and throughout the 19th century, what we see is that the crises that give rise to the need for this modern apparatus of state control is resistance to regimes of profound exploitation. In particular, slavery, colonialism, and mass industrialization. So proponents of a kind of liberal myth of policing will always point to the London Metropolitan Police as the first police force, which turns out not to be true by a long shot. And that it represented this ideal liberal democratic notion of policing by consent, rooted in a kind of naive legal formalism that says, well, the law represents the interests of the general will and serves the interests of society as a whole, and that policing exists to be the neutral technical enforcers of that system of laws in a way that should benefit everyone. So any attack on the police, diminishment of policing, is perceived, according to this worldview, as an attack on social order. Now, what I argue is that, first of all, we should understand the actual origins of the London Metropolitan Police, created, as you point out, by Sir Robert Peel, Robert, Bob, the Bobbies. And of course, where did he develop this idea? It wasn't in London. It was while he was in charge of the English occupation of Ireland, a colonial project. And he needed a tool to manage resistance to colonial occupation at a time when the British military were tied up with Napoleon on the continent and the treasury was somewhat bare. And so he needs something that is both more efficient, cost effective, and nimble, more able to develop a sense of legitimacy, which would allow them to minimize expenses and the use of violence. So he creates the Irish Peace Preservation Force, which eventually becomes the Royal Irish Constabulary. And it is that model that he then brings to London, not to manage colonialism or slavery, but to manage this massive influx of rural workers displaced by the rural enclosures that are happening, the taking away of common lands, and people out of desperation are flocking into the cities in hopes of finding employment in this new expanding industrial economy. But the result is a high degree of social chaos, including labor strikes and bread riots and working class mobilization that results in things like the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester, that is dealt with by the militia in a very crude, heavy-handed fashion that creates backlash. So Peel comes in and says, I have a plan to restore order, which is we're going to create this police force. We're going to give it more legitimacy. We're going to tie it to the law, not raw colonial power. But ultimately, that law enforcement function is really about creating order. And that order does not benefit everyone equally, nor do the legal systems that are associated with it, right? This is a period of growing inequality, social dislocation, and chaos for working class people and the very poor. And policing exists to put a lid on the resistance to that system of exploitation. And we see the same dynamics internationally, where we see police forces created well before the London Metropolitan Police to manage things like colonialism and slavery.
Right, thank you. And that reminded me about the famous quote from Schrader's book. We are dealing with the effects, not causes. Right. One of the sort of functions of police is to solve the problems at the surface, not to question what is underneath and try to solve the root, the
That's right.
problems of the society.
To manage the acts of resistance and the social chaos that result from these systems of exploitation.
Right. So Mm, from there, I mean, you automatically answered my follow-up question to that about Neoclis's Fury. So thanks for that, saving time for me. So
Well, I'll
we
just maybe say just a little bit more about
please,
Mark's
yeah,
really important work, which is just this idea that policing is not a passive response to someone calls about a crime. They are an active agent of producing social order, of manufacturing a stable working class through the intensive, invasive, and often proactive intervention of policing. So they are fabricating social order.
hmm and I think one of the ways in which they produced, or let's say manufactured, those sort of roots, or let's say purposes, right, was the war on drugs, which will be arriving at a little bit later. But I'd like to sort of briefly mention Edward Lawson Jr.'s work from the University of South Carolina, who found in his study that there is a significant association between militarization and the number of killings of suspects. So I would like to ask you about your insights on militarization. And in the
Yeah.
book, you suggest that the amount and nature of police training has less to do with preventing police brutality than the socioeconomic setting in which both sides gravitate towards physical or non-physical conflict. Do you believe that hammers and nails theory is a part of it? For the ones who are unfamiliar, hammers and nails theory posits that if you have a hammer, you are looking for a nail.
Yeah. So, well, I think of it this way, right? That first of all, policing as an institution is about violence work. That's what distinguishes policing from all of the kinds of government interventions is the authority and capacity to use violence. And Nicole Siegel's work, Violence Workers, is great on this in laying this out. But this has been a long understood element of policing. So we should always expect some violence and, of course, the constant threat of violence to be at the center of policing. But that level of violence can go up and down, and it plays a role in relationship to legitimation, but also it's an expression of the level of resistance and social chaos that the state feels it has to address. So we see police militarization often linked to these kinds of crises, like 9/11, like the rise of Black militancy in the 1960s. So the first SWAT team in the United States is created in Los Angeles in the wake of the Watts riots, and their first mobilization is to violently attack the headquarters of the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles, right? So it's created under the guise of law enforcement and crime suppression, but the crises that give rise to it are actually political crises, threats to the order that are much more profound than an individual bank robbery, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
So police militarization right now is driven in part, because we've created this massively unequal society, and that has generated a certain amount of social chaos and resistance. And the response of the state to that has been to create a war on drugs and a war on crime and a war on terror and a war on immigrants and a war on gangs. And the result has been a more warlike posture for policing. But this, interestingly, it does create a legitimation problem. When people see armored personnel carriers patrolling the streets of American cities and responding to protests, this does create, a legitimacy problem, and that is going on. And so we do see some backlash to this militarization happening.
Absolutely. And I think it is worth noting this militarization part also as a concept of war, right? You mentioned war on drugs, war on crime, and so on. And I think Stuart Schrader demonstrated it successfully that how war overseas were adopted by figures like Daryl Gates, who is the creator, the founding father of SWAT teams, who actually consulted the Marines at um, I don't remember the location, but he went there
Chavez
with it.
Ravine, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He went there with his team and he ordered his men to read whatever he could get their hands on about guerrilla warfare, basically, and
Counterinsurgency, yeah.
exactly counterinsurgency, as the title of the Schrader's book as well includes. So I think also as a concept, this us and versus them mentality partially comes from this adaptation of war rhetoric, sort of domesticized against U.S. citizens. Can we say that too?
Which is driven by politics, not by crime.
Exactly, fundamentally right. Okay, so I think here it is. I think we can talk about here war on drugs. If we talk about police militarization, war on drugs, I believe, peaked during the Reagan years, and you argue in the book that the initiative was instrumentalized for political gain, as you previously mentioned, thus being a quote political lie, end quote. Can you expand on the use of morals in politics and social policy and how it sort of is transposed to policing?
Yeah, well, of course, Stuart Hall, the British scholar, was very good on this, the role of moral panics in generating support for criminalization of vulnerable populations, especially non-white ones. So I think, a whole generation of us have been guided by his work on this topic. So the way I understand this, right, is that what we've done is we've created a system of exploitation. Now, we don't have colonialism and slavery in this 19th century sense, and in the States, we barely have industrialization anymore. What we have is a kind of a system of neoliberal austerity, where government has decided to liberalize borders for trade and the movement of capital. and created global competition to drive down wages and regulations. And as part of that dynamic, local states have felt the need to subsidize the already most successful economic actors in hopes that they will be globally competitive in a way that will allow them to generate wealth that they hope will, trickle down to the rest of us. But what this has been, this is a roundabout answer, but I think you'll see where I'm going in a second. So what this has produced is not broad economic prosperity. What this has produced is wild economic inequality, a class of billionaires on the one hand, and on the other hand, mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed public institutions like schools and healthcare systems. And then those problems, which are at root economic, have been redefined as problems of individual and group moral failure. So the reason someone is homeless is because they're a drug addict. The reason someone is a drug addict is because they have no willpower. The reason someone is dealing drugs is because they're a sociopath. They don't care, right? And so just erasing all of these larger political economic considerations in favor of a moralistic framework rooted in a politics of revenge and retribution and violent control. So, whenever we see a social problem turned over to policing, what we're witnessing is an act of ideological transformation in which political economic failures are transformed into questions of bad morality.
Absolutely. And I have a book here called The Code of the Street. I mean, it's untouched, but I read the electronic version and bought the print one out of fandom. Here, there's a short section about called the game. When you grow up in a, let's say, low class African American, poverty stricken neighborhood, you either, let's say, without a dad and a very traumatized mom, you you either try to go to school without sort of getting your hands on anything else on the street and get bullied, or you sort of start dealing drugs and sort of making easy money and start sort of buying expensive clothes and chains, and that looks to you as a person in that particular area without any scope or frame of the real world and how everything works. It just looks more attractive, more accessible, rather than just trying to get by in the public school system and try to develop yourself, right? And by playing the game, sort of that's your way, in a way, to survive on the street, rather than just have this frame of thinking about rules and society and government and anything else, right?
Yeah, so that's a great book. I also recommend Victor Rios's book Punished, which looks at Oakland. So what we have here is kind of classic strain theory, Mertonian strain theory, which says, look, young people in very poor, racially segregated communities basically want the same kinds of things that kids in rich suburbs want. They want spending money, they want social respect, they want a sense of inclusiveness, they want security in their lives, but the circumstances that they live in are not capable of providing that through means that we consider appropriate and legitimate. These kids don't have access to after school jobs. They don't have access to other forms of validation. They feel their lives are going to be very short. They think in short term time horizons often. And they have to deal with profound insecurity, financial insecurity, food insecurity, housing insecurity, but also insecurity from violence from other kids struggling under similar circumstances. And so they make what are essentially a set of pretty rational calculations about how to manage those insecurities in a situation where normal mechanisms are not available to them. So that means involvement in black market activity and the necessity of mobilizing violence, either through forming up into groups for self-protection or just enacting violence in their everyday lives as a form of creating a kind of reputation that they hope will actually reduce the necessity of violence in the future.
Right. So sort of a long-term thinking is involved as well. So I think as a potential solution to this issue in low-income neighborhoods and areas, there was this concept of community policing. The idea was that police would be extremely friendly, dressed down, or let's say just patrol the streets on foot with a partner and don't show guns or whatsoever, right? And one of the attempts to actually create an interesting attempt to create a friendly and cooperative atmosphere for the police in society was, I guess, Victor Cezankes of Menlo Park, California. And as the police chief, he tried to redress the police officers as casual with blazers, had them hide their guns, allowed them to grow hair and beard. And there's COPS, community oriented policing services. So, is the understanding of community policing same in public and police departments? Do you think community policing is effective in crime prevention?
So, com- first of all, communities that don't have profound inequality and exploitation going on already have a kind of community policing. If you look at monolithic, homogenous, wealthy suburbs, police play almost no role in the lives of residents. They maybe get pulled over because they have a headlight out and the officer just gives them a little, did you know that your headlight was out? And then they can continue on their way, right? So the level of police intensity in the lives of people is tied to the level of resistance and social chaos that are directly linked to these systems of exploitation. So the idea that we're going to both wage a war on drugs and have community policing is nonsensical. Cannot do both things, because when push comes to shove, literally, the police will push and shove and continue to escalate. So what community policing really is, it's an ideology that is designed to try to restore public confidence in the police, typically after some kind of profound crisis of legitimacy. So we see discourses around community policing emerge in the wake of things like the Rodney King riots, the shooting of Amadou Diallo here in New York, and more recently in response to the various crises we've seen over the last 6 years or so. This is always nonsense. No, first of all, no real changes are made. This is done on paper. A couple of officers are assigned to go to some community meetings, but it doesn't really affect the way law enforcement happens or is experienced by people in heavily policed communities. And very quickly, the police return to type, which is when their mission is to manage disorder, social chaos, etc., they will use aggressive and violent methods. And all this talk about community policing is just PR nonsense. And that's why the research shows two things. One is that no one can figure out what it is because it's just made up, doesn't really exist. And even when we have some idea of what it is, the second set of research shows it doesn't accomplish anything. So even its proponents now say things like, well, we never said it was going to be about crime control. We said it was going to be about building community trust. But what's the point of community trust? I mean, that's about relegitimating a system that is fundamentally illegitimate and unjust. So I'm not actually interested in pursuing policies to relegitimate policing.
Mm, thank you. I think we can from here move on to mass incarceration. One of the topics that you extensively discuss in your works, and you are, of course, a fierce critic of the prison industrial complex. And you start your chapter on mass incarceration with the incident of a 15-year-old African American girl in Florida getting arrested in school for misbehavior. Then you continue to discuss school resource officers, school policing, and school police militarization in itself, which I read for the first time, so I was very excited about it to discover that. But I was also curious about the economics of policing. So we know from the war on drugs policy that law enforcement agencies, or in specific paramilitary police units, were able to fund themselves with drug operations to upgrade and expand their equipment and operations. How about prisons? Are they some type of a lucrative business initiatives for governments or private enterprises?
So this is a really important question, in part because it's a very live debate among folks who are concerned about the, extent and intensity of our criminal legal system in the United States. And we've heard a number of liberal and progressives concerned about these issues talk about their concerns about private prisons, police foundations, uh, asset forfeiture. And of course, I am concerned about these things. But I think that there's a way in which they pretty profoundly miss the forest for the trees. So we have in some parts of the country, mostly in relationship to federal immigration detention facilities, we have some private prisons and detention facilities that are run by for-profit companies who claim that they can run these facilities more cheaply and effectively than federally owned and operated facilities, which hasn't really proven to be true. And there are big problems with conditions and medical care and deaths in custody and all the rest. But this has led some people to say, aha, see, the prison system exists in part because of financial incentives. And I think they're evoking an important history, which is things like convict leasing, which developed in the American South following the Civil War, in which blacks were caught up in the criminal legal system through all kinds of illegitimate means and then sold into forced labor in a way that generated massive wealth for companies and individuals across the South. They really built the South on the back of this new form of slave labor. But that's not what's going on now. That's not what's going on now. What's going on now is that they're propping up this broader system of neoliberal austerity through the criminalization of populations that are a source of threat to that system, either through social chaos or direct resistance. And this is a system of warehousing people, of neutralizing people, not of exploiting them through prison labor and private prisons. That is gravy that falls off the side of the plate. So, of course, in a system of neoliberal exploitation, the systems of social control will be subject to the same logics of neoliberal expropriation through privatization and exploitation, but that is chump change. What's really at stake here is not $100 million prison contract. It's the trillions of dollars in tax breaks to the rich, corporate subsidies, and this whole system of pushing wealth up the economic ladder. So while we might want to wage a campaign against prison laborers or private prisons or asset forfeiture as part of a broader strategy, it's a real mistake to think that those campaigns in and of themselves will do anything to reduce mass criminalization and mass incarceration. And I'll just end by saying here in New York State, we have no private prisons, we have no prison labor for corporations, and we got plenty of mass incarceration.
I see. Thanks for that, Professor. And I think I can sort of do a follow-up question on mapping police violence. So I'm just going to share this sort of website. I found this on your personal website. What does this website do, and what can the visitors find there?
Well, there are a number of folks who are making an effort to try to better document what are essentially the harms that come with policing. So we can find where the police departments refuse to accurately and fully report the violence that they commit on Americans. So we have no official statistics on even how many people police kill every year. So it's become incumbent on independent researchers and journalists to try to track down as much data of this kind as they can through open source material like local press reports. And so mapping police violence is one of the tools that people use to try to track some of this data. Why it's important to me is that what we hear from many liberal proponents of policing is that, well, we have a few studies that show that in some very strange circumstances, we got a little bit of positive effect from some type of police intervention. Therefore, policing works and we should do as much of it as we can. But what they never, ever calculate is what the costs of those interventions are. And I'm not just talking about the financial costs. I'm talking about the costs in terms of lives lost, of bodies brutalized, of people intimidated, harassed, and terrorized. And these are real costs on intensively policed communities that have measurable negative public health implications. So much so that the American Public Health Association issued a statement a few years ago specifically saying that police violence is a major public health problem in the United States. And the solution is to reduce our reliance on policing in as many ways as we can. So we got to
Right.
bring those costs into the equation before we make any statements about policing works.
So we outlined the problems, well, in many different ways, and I hope we were able to reconceptualize the concept of policing and the idea and different aspects of it. But you were also, when I was reading your work, I was also very impressed by the number of solutions and alternatives you included at the end of each section, and you tried to provide alternatives and solutions for the government and the problems arising from policing, right? In many different dimensions. So I was wondering, what are, let's say, the primary alternatives that you present to the way in which policing in the United States is partially failing to do
Yeah.
what it's set out to accomplish.
So sometimes what you hear from folks who are encountering some of these ideas for the first time is like, well, what are you going to have instead of policing? And too often they're what they're imagining, they're stuck in this mindset of like, well, there's this one thing that we use to manage harm in society. And that is a mistake. And that's part of why policing doesn't work well to deal with harm, is that the harms in society take many, many different forms and are the result of many, many different social dynamics. And so we can't have some one size fits all strategy. So the emphasis here is initially on prevention and then on harm reduction. So policing is typically a reactive force, right? Harm has occurred, and then some police show up and typically actually do nothing, take a report, right? The vast majority of violent crime in the US is not reported to police, is not solved by police, doesn't, about 2% of all violent crime in the US results in some kind of conviction, according to the Vera Institute of Justice. So, what we need are interventions that are tailored to address specific public safety concerns. So when I have these conversations with elected officials, with community-based organizations, you know, community groups, the first thing we have to talk about is, well, what are the public safety problems? Is it air pollution? Is it predatory lending? Is it lead in the water supply? Is it car break-ins? Is it armed robberies? Is it kids shooting each other? Well, all of those are harms that we need to address, but all of them require very different kinds of strategies. So you mentioned school policing at one point. Uh, we have flooded our schools with police while defunding basic services for students. So we got millions of kids going to schools with school police, but no school nurse, no school counselors, or very inadequate provision of that stuff. So we have these counselors, not cops, police free schools movements that don't just want to eliminate school police, they want investments in counselors, high quality after school programs, social workers to provide support for students in crises, restorative justice programs instead of zero tolerance disciplinary systems, etc. We've seen a lot of cities in the US move in this direction, about 40 or 50 just in the last couple of years. We've also seen a bunch of cities embrace the idea of non-police mental health crisis response capacity. So that when someone is having a mental health crisis, instead of getting a police response, they get a team of mental health, social work, outreach workers who are actually trained to deal with that kind of a problem. Between a quarter and a half of all people killed in the United States by police are having a mental health crisis. So if we could just get the police out of the mental health response business, we could save hundreds of lives a year just from that one intervention. At the same time, we need to build better community-based mental health services so people don't have so many crises. Obviously, we need to get rid of the war on drugs, shut down the narcotics units. We could look at Portugal as a model for this, where they decriminalized all drugs, have converted it into a public health issue, and have much better outcomes as a result. They've invested in treatment and harm reduction initiatives that have shown great promise. It doesn't mean that no one's using drugs, and it doesn't mean that there's no harm, but it's dramatically better than using policing, and it creates the possibility of further improvements. So those are just a few examples.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And when you read the book, you can find numerous different alternatives also that you mention about the ways to solve sort of those detrimental effects and consequences of the current policing. And that's why maybe by the title "The End of Policing" you mean the end of current system of this detrimental consequences that policing brings. But I think that's what happens when you judge a book by its cover and say that, yeah, at the end of policing means, like ripping the badges off and sort of, yeah, those different kind of
Yeah, I
funny
think there's
words.
a there's there's a certain kind of disingenuous response to this that says, "Oh, he just wants to get rid of all police tomorrow, and then it's the purge, it's chaos." Well, I only wish I had that much power. If I could just write a book that would then cause all police to disappear. I don't have the power to make that happen. It turns out no one has the power to make that happen, no one individual, right? We have a massive system of policing. It is not going to disappear overnight, no matter what we say or do. So, what we need to do is we need to make concrete decisions today, tomorrow, next week about how to move forward in a positive way. And police abolition, which guides my thinking here, is an analysis that helps guide our decision making right now about whether or not, for instance, to invest in 1,000 more transit police or supportive housing for 6,000 homeless people. To me, that's a simple choice. It's a decision today whether or not to vote for a politician who wants to expand the war on drugs versus a politician who wants to expand harm reduction and drug treatment. Those are real choices that are guided by an analysis that says that policing is an inherently harmful, unjust intervention, and we should try to get ourselves away from it in as many ways as we possibly can, one step at a time.
Exactly. So maybe I'm too obsessed with the word police, but doesn't policing mean ensuring and guaranteeing order, peace, uh, things working out well without anyone harming each other? And would that be the reason why people are too apprehensive about the hearing the phrase abolishing the police, because it poses a great threat to existence, right? Then the chaos would take over, so the safety issues. And is it maybe why the rhetoric of policing in the scope of law enforcement works pretty well and it keeps expanding because the reason for its legitimacy is so strong that they're able to just, you know, overcome any sort of barriers along the way and sort of dismiss any arguments, counter arguments.
Well, I think there are at least two issues here. One is the difference between the word police and policing.
Right.
So, in a way, a more accurate title of the book would be The End of Police rather than The End of Policing. Although I think we should try to do both. So, but policing is much broader than police, because policing is something that also exists in social welfare agency,
Mm-hmm.
child protective services, even the delivery often of medical care and other, and often in ways that are really problematic and harmful. The
Education.
education, absolutely. The focus of the book is on uniformed police, but I share concerns about these other areas, but that just didn't make it into this particular project. Now, part of the challenge, the second issue here, part of the challenge here is that people have been told over and over and over again for decades that the only tool that's available to them to produce public safety and security and order is police. And so when they hear, and this is even especially true in higher crime communities, when they hear you want to take away the one tool they've been told they can have, that's disruptive. It's scary to folks, and there's an initial resistance to it, and that's understandable because they have never had an opportunity to really talk about what could they have instead. But what we find is that when this is handled as an issue of community organizing, which is really what's going on in the United States all across the country, lots of community organizing around this, is when you put people in a room and you say to them, let's put everything on the table. If you could have anything you wanted to make this a safer, healthier community, turns out policing starts falling way, 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 way down at the bottom of the list. And we got a lot of examples of this. In Ithaca, New York, for instance, they have a drug problem like most American cities, and the mayor there knew that policing was a bad tool for managing it. So he brought community groups together and brought in some experts, and they said, look, let's put everything on the table. Let's explore everything we could possibly do. And they issued what's called the Ithaca Plan, and policing isn't even in it. When you give people real choices and a sense that they have some power of control over the conditions in their own community, what they want is jobs and healthcare and mental health services and substance abuse treatment and recreation programs and mentoring. They don't want police. They only want police when the choice is police or nothing. And even then, people are deeply skeptical about it.
Right. Thank you, Professor, for answering all my questions. I think I'd like to finish up on a entertaining note. I brought up a clip from a video game to you. It's titled Cyberpunk 2077, and I showed it to Dr. Schrader, and he was actually surprised by it, and we had an interesting conversation afterwards, and I would love to hear your comments on this. So this is a video game, a cyberpunk video game, sort of takes place in the future, so the technology is advanced immensely and so on. And what, of course, caught my attention as a gamer was the way in which police was presented, as well as the, let's say, the crime prevention. So I'm going to show you this very short clip, like 30 seconds. And my question will be about your way of thinking about the future of policing, whether you are pessimistic, and how accurate you think, or how prophetic you think this video game presents policing. So here we are. I hope you're able to see it.
Gunks out there, though. Just a midday snack for him. Well, show's over.
Okay, froze.
Come on! Ain't got all day! Good. Check it out, V. Shit's going down. Get there! Fucking shoot!
You look like your average bust.
This ain't your average badges. It's MaxTac. NCPD's apex predators. MTAC rolls in when things fly out of hand. Gunks out there, though. Just a midday snack for him. Well, show's over.
So they are not your regular badges. They are MaxTac, right? They're like so-called SWAT. So first impression, any impressions?
Well, who wants to live in that world? Certainly not me. That's a world of barbed wire and cars on fire and concrete and obviously constant violence. Constant violence. So that's a failed society. And the policing is just a reflection of the failed society that we see there. So that's a dystopian future, and I certainly don't want any part of it.
On a side note, that in this story, the territorial and jurisdictional power of policing is massively reduced because companies, private security companies, took over the regions of the city.
Yeah. So, but this is my point, right? It's not. We need to think about police more expansively, and if we understand the use of violence to produce a social order rooted in systems of exploitation, then it helps us understand these dynamics, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's private security or public security. There's a long history of interplay between the two, right? Before we had state police forces, we had things like the coal and iron police in Pennsylvania, who were in charge of suppressing labor unrest on the behalf of employers, who were then deputized by the state for a fee of $1 a badge. And then that had its own internal contradictions of legitimacy. So then they created a state police force modeled on the Pennsylvania State Police, modeled on the U.S. occupation of the Philippines. So there's a long history of interplay between military, corporate power, and civilian policing. And all of them are designed to secure, re-legitimate systems of profound exploitation. So let's stay focused on these questions of real justice. Because real justice is not measured in how many people we put in prison. Real justice is about creating safe, secure, healthy societies. And we could do that. We could do that. We have the material wealth. We have the resources. We have to reject these systems of exploitation.
Well, Professor, thank you very much, and I hope this conversation will help people to understand and think about policing, not only in the panicking way, but also in different aspects. different factors that play significant roles, such as economy, as you mentioned, as well as other factors. And thank you very much once again for having this conversation with me.